Chapter 26 of Darnley by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. He is a worthy gentleman, exceedingly well read, and profited in strange concealments. Henry IV. It was hardly night when Sir Osborne departed. A faint and diminishing blush still tinged the eastern sky. The blackbird was still singing his full round notes from every thicket, and not a star had yet ventured forth upon the pathway of the sun, except one, that, bright and sweet even then, seemed like a fond and favoured child to the monarch of the sky, following fearlessly on his brilliant steps, while others held aloof. The calm of the evening sank down gently on the young adventurer's heart. It was so mild, so placid, and though perhaps pensive and tinged with melancholy, yet there was a sort of promise in that last smile of parting day, which led hope forward, and told of brighter moments yet to come. For some time the knight indulged in vague dreams, made up, as indeed is the whole dream of human life, of hopes and fears, expectation and despondency. Then, giving up thought for action, he spurred forward his horse, and proceeded as far as he could towards London. Longpole followed in silence, for, in spite of all his philosophy, he felt a sort of qualm at the idea of the long period which must intervene ere he could hope to see his pretty Geraldine, that took away several ounces of his loquacity. London at length spread wide before them, and after some needless circumambulation, owing to the knight's total ignorance of the labyrinthian intricacies of the city, and the dangerous littleness of Longpole's knowledge thereof, they at length reached Gracious Street, and discovered the small, square, paved court, long since built over, and I believe now occupied by a tea-dealer, but which then afforded a sort of area before the dwelling of the Flemish merchant, William Hans. On the left hand, nearest the river, was situated the counting-house, and to the front, as well as to the right, stretched a range of buildings which, from their Polyphemus-like appearance, having but one window or aperture in the front, except the door, the knight concluded to be those warehouses whose indiscriminate maw swallowed up the produce of all parts of the earth. Over the counting-house, however, appeared several smaller windows, principally glazed, and through one of these shone forth upon the night the light of a taper, giving notice that some one still waked within. While Longpole dismounted, and knocked with the hilt of his dagger against a little door by the side of that which led to the counting-house, the knight watched the light in the window. But he watched, and Longpole knocked in vain, for neither did the light move nor the door open, till Sir Osborne bethought him of a stratagem to call the merchant's attention. "Make a low knocking against the windows of the counting-house, Longpole," said he, "as if you were trying to force them. I have known these money-getters as deaf as adders to any sound but that which menaced the mammon." Longpole obeyed, and the moment after the light moved. "Hold, hold!" cried the knight, "he hears!" And the next moment the casement window was pushed up, through which the head of the good merchant protruded itself, vociferating, "Who's there? What do you want? I'll call to watch. Watch, watch!" "Taisez-vous!" cried the knight, addressing him in French, not being able to speak the Brabant dialect of the merchant, and yet not wishing to proclaim his errand aloud in English. "Nous sommes amis. Descendez, Guillaume Hans. C'est le sire de Darnley." "Oh, I'll come down," cried the merchant. "Run, Skippenhausen, and open te door. I'll come down, my good lord, in a minute." The two travellers had not now long to wait, for in a moment or two the little door at which Longpole had at first in vain applied for admission was thrown open by a personage, the profundity of whose nether garments, together with his long waistcoat, square-cut blue coat, with the seams, and there were many, all bound with white lace, induced Sir Osborne immediately to write him down for a Dutch navigator. Descending the stairs, immediately behind his first apparition, came the merchant himself, with his black gown, which had probably been laid aside for the night, now hurried on, not with the most correct adjustment in the world, for it looked very much as if turned inside out, which might well happen to a robe, the sleeves of which were not above 6 inches long. Sir Osborne, however, did not stay to investigate the subject very minutely, but explaining to the good merchant that he had something particular to say to him, he was conducted into the counting house, where he informed him as succinctly as possible of what had occurred and what he desired. Good Master Hans was prodigal of his astonishment, which vented itself in various exclamations in Flemish, English, and French; after which, coming to business, as he said, he told the knight that he could put up his horses in the same stable where he kept his drays, and that after that they would talk of the rest. "But on my word, good lord," said he, "I must go with your man myself, for there is not one soul in the place to let him in or out of the stable, which is behind the house." The most troublesome part of the affair for the moment was to take off the bard or horse armour that covered the knight's charger, as it could not be left in the stable till the next morning, when the merchant's carters would arrive; and poor William Hans was desperately afraid that the round of the watch would pass while the operation was in execution, and suppose that he was receiving some contraband goods, which might cause a search the next day. The business, however, was happily accomplished by the aid of the Dutch captain, who, seeing that there was something mysterious going forward, and having a taste that way, gave more active assistance than either his face or figure might have taught one to expect. He also it was who, while the good merchant, with the candle in his hand, led our friend Longpole with the horses to the stable, conducted the knight upstairs into the room where they had first discovered the light, and invited him, in extremely good English, to be seated. By the appearance of the chamber it seemed that Master Hans had been preparing to make great cheer for his captain, for various were the flagons and bottles that stood upon the table, together with trenchers and plates unused, and a pile of manchet and spice bread, with other signs and prognostications of a rere supper, not to mention an immense bowl which stood in the midst, and whose void rotundity seemed yearning for some savoury mass not yet concocted. It was not long before the merchant reappeared, accompanied by Longpole, who, according to the custom of those days, when many a various rank might be seen at the same board, seated himself at the farther end of the table, after having taken his master's cask, and soon engaged the Dutch captain in conversation, while the knight consulted with William Hans regarding the means of quitting England as speedily as possible. "It is very unlucky you did not let me know before," said the merchant, "for we might easily have got the ship of my good friend Skippenhausen there ready to day, and you could have sailed to morrow morning by the first tide. You might trust him with your life. Bless you, my good lord, 'tis he that brings me over the Bibles from Holland." "But cannot we sail the day after to morrow?" said the knight, "if one day will be sufficient to complete his freight?" "Oh, that he can," answered the merchant. "But what will you do till then?" he added, with a melancholy shake of the head. "You will never like to lie in warehouse like a parcel of dry goods." "Why, it must be so, I suppose," said the knight, "if you have any place capable of concealing me." "Oh, dear life, yes!" cried William Hans, "a place that would conceal a dozen. I had it made on purpose after that evil May day, when the wild rabblement of London rose, and nearly murdered all the strangers they could find. I thought what had happened might once happen again, so I had in some of my own country people, and caused it to be made very securely." The matter was now soon arranged. It was agreed that the knight and Longpole should lie concealed at the merchant's till the ship was ready to sail, and that then Master Skippenhausen was to provide them a safe passage to some town in Flanders; which being finally settled between all parties, it only remained to fix the price of their conveyance with the Dutchman. "I am an honest man," said he, on the subject being mentioned, "and will not rob you. If you were in no hurry to go, and could go quietly, I would charge you 10 marks a ton; but as you are in distress, I will only charge you 15. "Faith!" burst forth Longpole, "you are very liberal. Why do you charge us more, not less, because we are in distress?" "Certainly," answered the Dutchman with imperturbable tranquillity. "9 men out of 10 would charge you 5 times as much when they found you wanted to go very bad. Now I only charge you 1/2 more. "I believe you are right," said Sir Osborne. "However, I do not object to your price. But tell me, what do you mean by 15 marks a ton? Do you intend to weigh us?" "To be sure," answered the Dutchman. "Why not? All my freight is weighed, and why not you too? No, no, I'll have nothing on board that is not weighed. It's all put in the book." "Well," said the knight with a smile, "it does not much matter. Can you take my horses too by weight?" "Certainly," replied the other. "I can take anything, but I am responsible for nothing. If your horses kick themselves to death in the hold, that is not my fault." "I will take care of that," said the knight. "Here, Longpole, help me to put off my harness. I cannot sit in it all night." While the custrel was thus employed in aiding his lord to disarm, the door opened, and in bustled a servant maid of about 2 or 3 and 30, whose rosy cheeks had acquired a deeper tinge by the soft wooing of a kitchen fire, and whose sharp eyes shot forth those brilliant rays generally supposed to be more animated by the wrathful spirit of cookery and of ardent coals than by any softer power or flame. Immediately that she beheld two strangers, forth burst upon the head of William Hans the impending storm. She abused him for telling her that there would only be himself and the captain. She vowed that she had not cooked half salmon enough for 4. She declared that she had only put down plates and bread for 2, and she ended by protesting that she never in her life had seen anybody so stupid as he himself, William Hans. To the mind of Sir Osborne, the lady somewhat forgot the respect due to her master; but, however, whether it was from one of those strange mysterious ascendancies which cooks and housekeepers occasionally acquire over middle-aged single men, or whether it was from a natural meekness of disposition in the worthy Fleming, he bore it with most exemplary patience; and when want of breath for a moment pulled the check-string of the lady's tongue, he informed her that the two strangers had come unexpectedly. Thereupon, muttering to herself something very like "Why the devil did they come at all?" she set down on the table a dish of hot boiled salmon, and after flouncing out of the room, returned with the air of the most injured person in the world, bringing in a platterful of dried peas, likewise boiled. These various ingredients (the salmon was salted) William Hans immediately seized upon, and emptied them into the great bowl we have already mentioned. Then, casting off his gown, and tucking up the sleeves of his coat, he mashed them all together, adding various slices of some well-preserved pippins, a wooden spoon's capacity of fine oil, and 3 of vinegar. Fancy such a mess to eat at 11 o'clock at night, and then go to bed and dream! Boiled salmon and peas, apples and oil, and vinegar to crown it! However, Sir Osborne resisted the tempting viands, and contented himself with some of the plain bread, although both the merchant and the captain pressed him several times to partake, assuring him, while the oil and vinegar ran out at the corners of their mouths, that it was very good indeed, excellent; and so much did they seem to enjoy it, that the unhappy Longpole was tempted for his sins to taste the egregious compound, and begged a small quantity at the hands of good Master Hans. The bountiful merchant shovelled a waggon load of it upon his plate, and the yeoman, fancying himself bound in common politeness to eat it, contrived to swallow 3 whole mouthfuls with a meekness and patience that in the succeeding reign would have classed him with the martyrs. But at the 4th his humanity rebelled, and thrusting the plate from him with a vehemence that nearly overturned all the rest, "No!" cried he, "no, there is no standing that!" The merchant and his countryman chuckled amazingly at poor Longpole's want of taste, and even the knight, albeit in no very laughter-loving mood, could not help smiling at his custrel's discomfiture. But as all things must come to an end, the salt salmon and peas were at length concluded, and some marmalades and confections substituted in their place, which proved much more suitable to the taste of such of the company as were uninitiated in the mysteries of Flemish cooking. With the sweetmeats came the wines, which were all of peculiar rarity and excellence; for in this particular at least, William Hans was a man of no small taste, which he kept indeed in continual practice. Not that we would imply that he drank too much, or too often, but still the god of the gilded horns had been gently fingering his nose, and with a light and skilful pencil had decorated all the adjacent parts with a minute and delicate tracery of interwoven rosy lines. As the wine diffused itself over his stomach, it seemed to buoy up his heart to his lips. Prudence, too, slackened her reins, and on went his tongue, galloping as a beggar's horse is reported to do, on a way that shall be nameless. Many were the things he said which he should not have said, and many were the things he told which would have been better left untold. Amongst others, he acknowledged himself a Lutheran, which in that age, if it tended to find out bliss in the other world, was very likely to bring down damnation in this. He averred that he looked upon the Bishop of Rome, as he called the Pope, in the light of that Babylonish old lady, whose more particular qualification is not fit for ears polite, and he confessed that when Dr. Fitzjames, the Bishop of London, had brought up all the translations of the Bible he could find, and burned them all at Paul's Cross, he had furnished the furious Romanist with a whole cargo of incomplete copies; so that, continued he, the bishop damned his own soul the more completely by burning God's work, and paid the freight and binding of a new and complete set into the bargain. And he chuckled and grinned with mercantile glee at his successful speculation, and with puritanic triumph over the persecutors of his sect. Sir Osborne soon began to be weary of the scene, and begged to know where he should find his chamber, upon which Master Hans rose to conduct him with perfect steadiness of limb, the wine having affected nothing but his tongue. Lighting a lamp, he preceded the knight with great reverence, and while Longpole followed with the armour, he led the way up a little narrow stair to a small room, the walls of which, though not covered with arras, were hung with painted canvas, after a common fashion of the day, representing the whole history of Jonah and the whale, wherein the fish was decidedly cod, and the sea undoubtedly butter and parsley, notwithstanding anything that the scientific may say to such an assemblage. The ship was evidently one that would have sunk in any sea except that she was in. She could not have sailed across Chancery Lane in a wet day without foundering, and as if to render her heavier, the artist had stowed her to the head with Dutchmen, rendering her, like the dinde à la Sainte Alliance, that is, a turkey stuffed with woodcocks, one heavy thing crammed full of another. The whole of the room, however, was cleanliness itself. The little bed that stood in the corner with its fine linen sheets, the small deal table, even the very sand upon the floor, all was as white as snow. "I am afraid, my good lord," said the merchant, who never lost his respect for his guest, "that your lordship will be poorly lodged; but these 3 chambers along in front are what I keep always ready, in case of any of my captains arriving unexpectedly, and it is all clean and proper, I can assure you. I will now go and bring you a cushion for your head, and what the friend call the coupe de bonne nuit, and I will myself call your lordship to morrow, before any one is up, that you may take your hiding place without being seen." The knight was somewhat surprised to find his host's recollection so clear, notwithstanding his potations; but he knew not what much habit in that kind will do, and still doubted whether his memory would be active enough to remind him that he was to call him when the next morning should really come. However, he did Master Hans injustice, for without fail, at the hour of 5, he presented himself at the knight's door, and soon after rousing Longpole, he conducted them both down to the warehouses, through whose deep obscurity they groped their way, amidst tuns and bags, and piles, and bales, with no other light than such straggling rays as found their way through the chinks and crevices of the boards which covered the windows for the night. At length an enormous butt presented itself, which appeared to be empty, for without any great effort the old merchant contrived to move it from its place. Behind it appeared a pile of untanned hides, which he set himself to put on one side as fast as possible, though for what purpose Sir Osborne did not well understand, as he beheld nothing behind them but the rough planks which formed the wall of the warehouse. As the pile diminished, a circumstance occurred which made all the parties hurry their movements, and dispatch the hides as fast as possible. This was nothing else than a loud and reiterated knocking at the outer door, which at first induced Master Hans to raise his head and listen; but then, without saying a word, he set himself to work again harder than ever, and with the assistance of the knight and Longpole, soon cleared away all obstruction, and left the fair face of the boarded wall before them. Kneeling down, the merchant now thrust his fingers under the planks, where the apparently rude workmanship of the builder had left a chink between them and the ground, then applied all his strength to a vigorous heave, and in a moment 3 of the planks at once slid up, being made to play in a groove, like the door of a lion's den, and discovered a small chamber beyond, lighted by a glazed aperture towards the sky. In, my good lord," cried the merchant. "Don't you hear how they are knocking at the door? They will soon rouse my maid Juliane, though she sleeps like a marmot. What they want I don't know." Sir Osborne and Longpole were not tardy in taking possession of their hiding place, and having themselves pulled down the sliding door by means of the crossbars, which in the inside united the 3 planks together, they fastened it with a little bolt, whereby any one within could render his retreat as firm, and to all appearance as immovable as the rest of the wall. They then heard the careful William Hans replace the hides, roll back the butt, and pace away, after which nothing met their ear but the unceasing knocking at the outer door, which seemed every minute to assume a fiercer character, and which was perfectly audible in their place of refuge. The merchant appeared to treat the matter very carelessly, and not to make any reply till it suited his convenience, for during some minutes he let the knockers knock on. At length, however, that particular sound ceased, and from a sort of rush and clatter of several tongues, the knight concluded that the door had been at length opened. At the same time, the voice of the Fleming made itself heard, in well assumed tones of passion, abusing the intruders for waking him up so early in the morning, bringing scandal upon his house, and taking away his character. "Seize the old villain!" cried another voice. "We have certain information that they are here. Search every hole and corner. They must have arrived last night." Such and various other broken sentences, pronounced by the loud tongue of some man in office, reached the ears of Sir Osborne, convincing him, notwithstanding Henry's assurance that till noon of that day he should remain unpursued, that Wolsey, taking advantage of the king's absence at Richmond, had lost no time in issuing the warrant for his arrest. Sitting down on a pile of books, which was the only thing that the little chamber contained, he listened with some degree of anxiety to the various noises of the search. Now it was a direction from the chief of the party to look here or to look there; now the various cries of the searchers, when they either thought they had discovered something suspicious, or were disappointed in some expectation; now the rolling of the butts, the overturning of the bales, the casting down of the skins and leathers. Now the party was far off, and now so near that the knight could hear every movement of the man who examined the hides before the door of his hiding place. At one time, in the eagerness of his search, the fellow even struck his elbow against the boarding, and might probably have discovered that it was hollow underneath, had not the tingling pain of his arm engaged all his attention, passing off in a fit of dancing and stamping, mingled with various ungodly execrations. At length, however, the pursuers seemed entirely foiled, and after having passed more than 2 hours, some in examining the dwelling house, and some the warehouse, after having tumbled over every article of poor William Hans's goods, their loud cries and insolent swaggering dwindled away to low murmurs of disappointment, and growing fainter and fainter as they proceeded to the door, the sounds at length ceased entirely, and left the place in complete silence. Not long after, the workmen arrived and began their ordinary occupations for the day, and Sir Osborne and Longpole thanked their happy stars, both for having escaped the present danger, and for their enemies' search being now probably turned in some other direction. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Darnley by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Norfolk. What, are you chafed? Ask God for temperance. That's the appliance only which your disease requires. Shakespeare. As the day passed on, Sir Osborne grew more and more impatient under his confinement. He felt a sort of degradation in being thus pent up, like a wild beast in a cage, and though with invincible patience he had lain 1,000 times more still in many an ambuscade, he felt an almost irresistible desire to unbolt the door, and assure himself that he was really at large, by going forth and exercising his limbs in the free air. But then came the remembrance that such a proceeding would almost infallibly transfer him to a still stricter prison, where, instead of being voluntary and but for one day, his imprisonment would be forced and long continued. The thought, too, of Constance de Grey, and the hope of winning her yet, gave great powers of endurance, and he contented himself with every now and then marching up and down the little chamber, which, taken transversely, just afforded him space for 3 steps and a half, and at other times with speaking in a whisper to Longpole, who, having brought the armour down with him, sat in one corner, polishing off any little dim spots that the damp of the night air might have left upon it. "This is very tiresome," said the knight. "Very tiresome indeed, my lord," replied Longpole. "I've been fancying myself a blackbird in a wicker cage for the last hour. May I whistle?" "No, no," cried the knight. "Give me the casque. I will polish that by way of doing something. Don't you think, Longpole, if underneath the volant piece a stout sort of avantaille were carried down, about 1 inch broad and 2 inches long, of hard steel, it would prevent the visor from being borne in, as I have often seen, by the blow of a solid lance?" "Yes," answered Longpole, "but it would prevent your lordship from blowing your nose. Oh, I do hate improvement, my lord. Depend upon it, 'tis the worst thing in the world. Men improve, and improve, and improve, till they leave nothing that's original on the earth. I would wager your lordship 100 marks, that, by 200 or 300 years hence, people will have so improved their armour that there will be none at all." "Zounds, Bill!" cried a voice in the warehouse. "Don't you hear some folks talking?" "It's some one in the street," answered another voice; yet it sounded vastly near, too. This, however, was quite sufficient warning for the knight to be silent, and taking up one of the books upon which he had been sitting, he found that it was an English version of the Bible, with copies of which it appears that Master William Hance was in the habit of supplying the English Protestants. Our Mother Eve's bad old habit of prying into forbidden sources of knowledge affects us all more or less, and as the Bible was at that time prohibited in England, except to the clergy, Sir Osborne very naturally opened it and began reading. What effect its perusal had upon his mind matters little. Suffice it that he read on, and found sufficient matter of interest therein to occupy him fully. Hour after hour fled, and day waned slowly, but having once laid his hand upon that book, the knight no longer felt the tardy current of time, and night fell before the day which he had anticipated as so tedious seemed to have passed half away. A long while elapsed after the darkness had interrupted Sir Osborne in his study, before the warehouse was closed for the night, which, however, was no sooner accomplished than good Master Hans, accompanied by his friend Skippenhausen, came to deliver them from their confinement. "He, he, he!" cried the merchant as they came forth. "Did you hear what a noise they made, my good lord, when they came searching this morning? They did not find them, though, for they were all in beside you." "What do you mean?" demanded the knight. "Who were in beside us? Nobody came here." "I mean the Bibles, I mean the word of God," cried the merchant. "The bread of life that those villains came seeking this morning, which, if they had got, they would have burnt most sacrilegiously, as an offering to the harlot of their idolatry." "Then I was wrong in supposing that they searched for me?" said the knight with a smile at his own mistake. "Oh, no, not for you at all," replied the merchant. "It was the Bibles that Skippenhausen brought over from Holland for the poor English Protestants, who are here denied to eat of the bread or drink of the water of salvation. But now, my lord, if you will condescend to be weighed, you will be ready to sail at 4 in the morning. for your horses and horse armour are all weighed and aboard, and the cargo will be complete when your lordship and your gentlemen are shipped." Finding that Master Skippenhausen was bent upon ascertaining his weight, Sir Osborne consented to get into the merchant's large scales, and being, as it were, lotted with Longpole, his horse bags, and his armour, he made a very respectable entry in the captain's books. After this, Master Hans led him into his counting house, and displayed his books before him. But as the items of his account might be somewhat tedious, it may be as well merely to say that the young knight found he had expended, in the short time he had remained in Henry's luxurious court, more than 2,500 marks, so that of the 2,700 which he had possessed in the hands of the Fleming, and the 1,000 which he had won at the Duke of Buckingham's, but 1,200 and a trifle remained. Sir Osborne was surprised, but the accurate merchant left no point in doubt, and the young knight began to think that it was lucky he had been driven from the court before all his funds were completely expended. He found, however, to his satisfaction, that a great variety of arms and warlike implements, which he had gathered together while in Flanders, and had left in the warehouses of the merchant since he had been in England, had been shipped on board Skippenhausen's vessel, whose acknowledgment of having received them William Hans now put into his hand, and having paid him the sum due and received an acquittance, he led him once more upstairs into the scene of the last night's revel. We shall pass over this second evening at the merchant's house without entering into any details thereof, only remarking that it passed more pleasantly than the former one, there being at the supper table some dishes which an Englishman could eat, and which his stomach might probably digest. At an early hour Sir Osborne cast himself upon his bed, and slept, though every now and then the thoughts of his approaching voyage made him start up and wonder what was the hour; and then, as Skippenhausen did not appear, he would lie down and sleep again, each half hour of this disturbed slumber seeming like a whole long night. At length, however, when he just began to enjoy a more tranquil rest, he was awakened by the seaman, and dressing himself as quickly as possible, he followed to William Hans's parlour, where the worthy merchant waited to drink a parting cup with his guests, and wish them a prosperous voyage. As the easiest means of carrying their harness, Sir Osborne and Longpole had both armed themselves, and as soon as they had received the Fleming's benediction in a cup of sack, they donned their casques and followed the captain towards the vessel. It was a dull and drizzly morning, and many was the dark foul street, and many the narrow tortuous lane through which they had to pass. Wapping, all dismal and wretched as it appears even nowadays to the unfortunate voyager, who, called from his warm bed in a wet London morning, is rolled along through its long, hopeless windings, and amidst its tall, spiritless houses, towards the ship destined to bear him to some other land, and which, with a perversion of intellect only to be met with in ships, stage-coaches, and other wooden-headed things, is always sure to set out at an hour when all rational creatures are sleeping in their beds. Wapping, I say, as it stands at present, in its darkness and its filth, is gay and lightsome to the paths by which worshipful Master Skippenhausen conducted Sir Osborne and his follower towards his vessel. Sloppy, silent, and deserted, the streets boasted no living creatures besides themselves, unless, indeed, it was some poor mechanic, who, with his shoulders up to his ears, and his hands clasped together to keep them warm, picked his way through the dirt towards his early toil. The heavens frowned upon them, and the air that surrounded them was one of those chill, wet, thick, dispiriting atmospheres which no other city than London can boast in the month of May. There is a feeling of melancholy attached to quitting anything to which we have, even for a time, habituated our hopes and wishes, or even our thoughts. However dull, however uninteresting, a place may be in itself, if therein we have familiar associations and customary feelings, we must ever feel a degree of pain in leaving it. I am convinced there is a sort of glutinous quality in the mind of man, which sticks it to everything it rests upon, or is it attraction of cohesion? However, the knight had 1,000 sufficient reasons for feeling melancholy and depressed as he quitted the capital of his native land. He left behind him hopes and expectations, and affection and love, almost all those feelings which, like the various colours mingled in a sunbeam, unite to form the light of human existence, and without which it is dull, dark, and heavy, like heaven without the sun. And yet, perhaps, he would have felt the parting less had the morning looked more brightly on him, had there been one gleam of light to give a fair augury for willing hope to seize. But no, it was all black and gloomy, and the very sky seemed to reflect the feelings of his own bosom. Thus, as he walked along after the captain, there was a stern, heavy determination in his footfall, unlike either the step of expectation or the calm march of contentment. What he felt was not precisely despair, it was the bitterness of much disappointment, and he strode quickly onward, as if at once to conquer and to fly from his own sensations. At length a narrow lane brought them to the side of the river, where waited a boat to convey them to the Dutchman's ship, which lay out some way from the bank. Besides the stairs stood a man apparently on the watch, but he seemed quite familiar with Master Skippenhausen, who gave him a nod as he passed, and pointing to his companions, said, "This is the gentleman and his servant." "Very well," said the man, "go on;" and the whole party, taking their places in the boat without further question, were speedily pulled round to the vessel by the 2 stout Dutchmen who awaited them. As soon as they were on board, the captain led the knight down into the cabin, which he found in a state of glorious confusion, but which Skippenhausen assured him would be the safest place for him till they had got some way down the river, for that they might have visitors on board, whom he could not prevent from seeing all that were upon the deck, though he would take care that they should not come below. "Ay, Master Skippenhausen," cried Longpole, "for God's sake fetter all spies and informers with a silver ring, and let us up on deck again as soon as possible, for I am tired of being hid about in holes and corners like a crooked silver groat in the box of a careful maid; and as for my lord, he looks more weary of it than even I am." The master promised faithfully that as soon as the vessel had passed Blackwall he would give them notice, and then proceeded to the deck, where, almost immediately after, all the roaring and screaming made itself heard which seems absolutely necessary to get a ship under way. In truth, it was a concert as delectable as any that ever greeted a poor voyager on his outset. The yelling of the seamen, the roaring of the master and his subordinates, the creaking and whistling of the masts and cordage, together with volleys of clumsy Dutch oaths, all reached the ears of the knight, as he sat below in the close foul cabin, and, joined to his own painful feelings, made him almost fancy himself in the Dutch part of Hades. Still, the swinging of the vessel told that, though not as an effect, yet at least as an accompaniment to all this din, the ship was already on her voyage, and after a few minutes a more regular and easy motion began to take place, as she glided down what is now called the Pool. However, much raving and swearing and cursing to no purpose still went on, whenever the vessel passed in the proximity of another, and as there were several dropping down at the same time, manifold were the opportunities which presented themselves for the captain and the pilot to exercise their execrative faculties. But at length the disturbance began to cease, and the ship held her even course down the river, while the sun, now fully risen, dispelled the clouds that had hung over the early morning, and the day looked more favourably upon their passage. Sir Osborne gazed out of the little window in the stern, noticing the various villages as they passed on their way down, till the palace at Greenwich, and the park sweeping up behind, met his eye, together with many a little object associated with hopes and feelings and happiness gone by, recalling most painfully all that expectation had promised and disappointment had done away. It was too much to look upon steadily, and turning from the sight, he folded his arms on the table, and burying his eyes on them, remained in that position till the master descending told him that they were now free from all danger. On this information, the knight gladly mounted the ladder, and paced up and down the deck, enjoying the free air, while Longpole jested with Master Skippenhausen, teasing him the more, perhaps, because he saw that the seaman had put on that sort of surly, domineering air which the master of a vessel often assumes the moment his foot touches the deck, however gay and mild he may be on shore. Nevertheless, as we are now rapidly approaching that part of this book wherein the events become more thronged and pressing, we must take the liberty of leaving out all the long conversation which Vonderbrugius reports as having taken place between Skippenhausen and Longpole, as well as a very minute and particular account of a sail down the river Thames, wherewith the learned professor embellishes his story, and which, though doubtless very interesting to the Dutch burgomasters and their wives of a century and a half ago, would not greatly edify the British public of the present day, when every cook-maid steps once a year into the steam-packet and is paddled down to Margate, with less trouble than it took an Englishman in the reign of Harry VIII to go from Charing Cross to Lombard Street. The wind was in their favour, and the tide running strongly down, so that passing, one by one, Woolwich, Purfleet, Erith, Gravesend, and sundry other places, in a few hours they approached near the ocean limits of the English land, while the river, growing mightier and mightier as it rolled on, seemed to rush towards the sea with a sort of daring equality, rather a rival than a tributary, till, meeting its giant sovereign, it gave vent to its pride in a few frothy waves, and then, yielding to his sway, poured all its treasures in his bosom. Before they had reached the mouth of the river, they beheld a vessel which had preceded them suddenly take in sail and lie to under the lee of the Essex shore, the reason of which was made very evident the moment after, by the vane and the masthead wheeling round, and the wind coming in heavy squalls right upon their beam. The Dutchman's ship was not one at all calculated to sail near the wind, and paying little consideration to the necessity of Sir Osborne's case, he followed the example of the vessel before him, and gave orders for taking in sail and lying to, declaring that the gale would not last. The knight remonstrated, but he might as well have talked to the wind itself. Skippenhausen was quite inflexible, not even taking the pains to answer a word, and, contenting himself with muttering a few sentences in High Dutch, interspersed with various objurgatory addresses to the sailors. Whether the worthy Hollander's conduct on this occasion was right, proper, and seamanlike, we must leave to some better qualified tribunal than our own weak noddle to determine, professing to be most profoundly ignorant on nautical affairs. But so the matter stood, and the knight was obliged to swing one whole night in an uncomfortable hammock, in an uncomfortable ship, in the mouth of the river Thames, with a bitter fancy resting on his mind that this waste of time was quite unnecessary, and that with a little courage and a little skill on the part of the master, he might before the next morning have been landed at Dunkirk, to which city he was to be safely carried, according to his agreement with the Dutchman. By daybreak the next morning the wind was rather more favourable, and at all events by no means violent, so that the vessel was soon once more under way. Still, however, they made but little progress, and even the ship that was before them, though a faster sailer, and one that could keep nearer the wind, made little more way than themselves. While in this situation, trying by a long tack to mend their course, with about the distance of half a mile between them and the other vessel, they perceived a ship of war apparently run out from the Essex coast some way to windward, and bear down upon them with all sail set. "Who have we here, I wonder?" said the knight, addressing Skippenhausen, who had been watching the approaching vessel attentively for some minutes. "'Tis an English man of war," replied the master. "Coot now! Don't you see the red cross on her flag? By my life, she is making a signal to us. It must be you she is wanting, my lord, for on my life I have nothing contraband but you aboard. I will not understand her signal, though, and as the breeze is coming up, I will run for it. You go down in the cabin and hide yourself." "I will go down," replied the knight, "but hide myself I will not. I have had too much of it already." Skippenhausen, who, as we before hinted, had by the long habit of smuggling in a small way acquired a taste for the concealed and mysterious, tried in vain to persuade the knight to hide himself under a pile of bedding. On this subject Sir Osborne was as deaf as the other had been the night before, in regard to proceeding on their voyage, and all the concession that the master could obtain was that the two Englishmen would go below and wait the event, while he tried, by altering his course and running before the wind, to weary the pursuers, if they were not very hearty in the cause. "Well, Longpole," said Sir Osborne, "I suppose that we must look upon ourselves as caught at last." "Would your worship like us to stand to our arms?" demanded the yeoman. "We could make this cabin good a long while in case of necessity." "By no means," replied the knight. "I will on no account resist the king's will. Besides, it would be spilling good blood to little purpose, for we must yield at last." "As your lordship pleases," answered the custrel. "But knowing how fond you are of a good downright blow of istock at a fair gentleman's head, I thought you might like to take advantage of the present occasion, which may be your last for some time." "Perhaps it may be a mistake still," answered the knight, "and pass away like the search for the Bibles when we were concealed in the warehouse. However, we shall soon see. At all events, till it comes I shall take no heed about it." And casting himself into a seat with a bitter smile, as if wearied out with fortune's caprices, and resolved to struggle no longer for her favour, he gazed forth from the little stern window upon the wide expanse of water that rolled away towards the horizon. The aperture of this window, not being more than 6 inches either in height or width, and cut through the thick timbers of the Dutch vessel for considerably more than a foot in depth, was in fact not much better than a telescope without a glass, so that the knight's view was not a little circumscribed in respect to all the nearer objects, and he was only able to see, as the ship pitched, the glassy green waves, mingled with white foam, rushing tumultuously from under her stern as she now scudded before the wind, leaving a long, glistening, frothy track behind to mark where she had made her path through the midst of the broad sea. As he looked farther out, however, the prospect widened, and at the extreme verge, where the sea and the sky, almost one in unity of hue, showed still a faint line of light to mark their boundary, he could perceive, rising up as it were from the bosom of the deep, the light tracery of masts and rigging belonging to far distant vessels, whose hulls were still concealed by the convexity of the waters. Nearer, but yet within the range that the narrowness of the window allowed his sight, appeared the vessel that had dropped down the river just before them, and the English ship of war, which, crowding all sail before the wind, seemed in full chase, not of their companion, but of themselves; for the other, in obedience to the signal, had hauled her wind and lay to. Sir Osborne now watched to ascertain whether the man of war gained upon them, but an instant's observation put an end to all doubt. She evidently came nearer and nearer, and soon approached so close as scarcely to be within range of his view, being lost and seen alternately at every motion of the ship. At length, as the vessel pitched, she disappeared for a moment, then came in sight again. A quick flash glanced along her bow, and the moment after, when she was no longer visible to his eye, the sullen report of a cannon came upon the wind. By a sudden change in the motion of the vessel, together with various cries upon the deck, the knight now concluded that the Dutchman had at length obeyed this peremptory signal and lay to, which was in fact the case; for passing over to the window on the other side, he again got a view of the English ship, which sailed majestically up, and then, when within a few hundred yards, put out and manned a boat, which rowed off towards them. Sir Osborne had not long an opportunity of observing the boat in her approach, as she soon passed out of the small space which he could see; but in a few minutes after, the voice of some one, raised to its very highest pitch, made itself heard from a distance, hardly near enough for the knight to distinguish the words. He every now and then caught enough to perceive that the whole consisted of a volley of curses discharged at Master Skippenhausen for not having obeyed the signal. The Dutchman replied, in a tone of angry surliness, that he had not seen the signal; and in a minute or two more, A harsh grating rush against the vessel told that the boat was alongside. "I will teach you, you Dutch son of a dogfish, not to lie to when one of the king's ships makes a signal," cried a loud voice by the side. "Have you any passengers on board?" "Yes, 5 or 6," answered the Dutchman. "Stop, I will come on board," cried the voice, and then proceeded, as if while climbing the ship's side. "Have yon one Sir Osborne Maurice with you?" "No," answered Skippenhausen stoutly. "Well, we will soon see that," cried the other, "for I have orders to attach him for high treason. Come, bustle, disperse, my boys. You, Wilfred, go forward. I will down here and see who is in the cabin, and if I find him, Master Dutchman, I will slit your ears." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Darnley by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. My conscience will serve me to run from this stew. Merchant of Venice. We will now return to Lady Constance de Grey, whose fate must no longer be left in uncertainty; and taking up the thread of our narrative at the moment Sir Osborne quitted her, on the eventful evening which destroyed all his fond expectations, we will, in our homely way, record the events that followed. It may be remembered that at the very instant the knight parted from good Dr. Wilbraham at the door of the young lady's apartment in the palace at Richmond, a letter was put into the clergyman's hands, to be delivered to the heiress of de Grey, for such was the style of the address. No time was lost by Dr. Wilbraham in giving the letter into his lady's hands, and on being opened, it proved to be one of those anonymous epistles which are seldom even worth the trouble of deciphering, being prompted always by some motive which dares not avow itself. However, as Lady Constance was very little in the habit of receiving letters from any one, and certainly none to which the writer dare not put his name, mere curiosity, if nothing else, would have prompted her to read it through; the more especially as it was written in a fine and clerkly hand, and in a style and manner to be acquired alone by high and courtly education. Although the letter is still extant, we shall not copy it, having already given one specimen of the compositions of that day, and not at all wishing to depreciate the times of our hero and heroine in the estimation of our more cultivated readers. Let it be considered as sufficient, then, that we merely say, the letter professed to be a warning from a friend, and informed the young lady that the most rigorous measures were about to be adopted towards her, in case of her still refusing to comply with Wolsey's command in respect to her marriage with Lord Derby. The writer then hinted that perpetual seclusion in a convent, together with the forfeiture of all her estates, would be the consequence, if she could not contrive to fly immediately; but that, if she could, her person at least would be at liberty, and that a friend would watch over her property; and, as a conclusion, he advised her to leave Richmond by water as the means which would leave the least trace of her course. So singularly did this letter anticipate not only her own fears, but also her own plans, that it instantly acquired, in the eyes of Lady Constance, an authenticity which it did not otherwise possess; and placing it in the hands of Dr. Wilbraham, she asked his opinion upon its contents. "Pshaw!" cried the clergyman, when he had read it. "Pshaw! lady, it is all nonsense. The very reverend Lord Cardinal will never try to make you marry against your will. Do not frighten yourself about it, my dear lady. Depend on it, 'tis all nonsense. Let me see it again." But after he had read it over once more, Dr. Wilbraham's opinion seemed in some degree to change. He considered the letter, and reconsidered it, with very thoughtful eyes, and then declared it was strange that any one should write it unless it were true; and yet he would not believe that either. "Pray, lady, have you any idea who wrote it?" demanded he. "I can imagine but one person," said Lady Constance, "who could possess the knowledge and would take the pains. Margaret, leave us," she continued, turning to the waiting woman. I have heard, my dear Dr. Wilbraham," she proceeded as soon as they were alone, "that you were in former times acquainted with an old knight called Sir Cesar. I met him yesterday when I was out in the park." Lady Constance paused, and a slight blush came into her cheek, as she remembered that the good clergyman knew nothing of the affection which subsisted between herself and Darnley, and feeling a strong repugnance to say that he was with her at the moment, she hesitated, not knowing how to proceed. Dr. Wilbraham relieved her, however, by exclaiming, the instant she stopped, "Oh yes, lady, in truth I know him well. He was the dearest and the best friend of my Lord Fitzbernard, and though unhappily given to strange and damnable pursuits, God forgive him, I must say he was a friend to all the human race, and a man to be trusted and esteemed. But think you this letter came from him?" "He is the only one," replied Constance, "on whom my mind could for a moment fix as having written it." "It is very likely," answered the clergyman. "It is very likely; and if it comes from him, you may believe every word that it contains. His knowledge, lady, is strange, is very strange, and is more than good, but it is sure. He is one of those restless spirits that must ever be busy, and human knowledge not being sufficient for his eager mind, he has sought more than he should seek, and found more than is for the peace of his soul." "But if he make good use of his knowledge," said Constance, "surely it cannot be very wicked, my dear sir?" "It is presumptuous, lady," replied the clergyman. "It is most presumptuous to seek what God has concealed from our poor nature." "But if this letter be from him," said the lady, "and the bad tidings that it brings be true, what ought I to do? You, whom my dear father left with me, asking you never to quit me, you must be my adviser, and tell me what to do in this emergency; for sure I am that you will never advise me to marry a man whom I do not love, and who does not even love me. No, no, heaven forbid, especially when you would rather marry Osborne," said the good clergyman with the utmost simplicity, looking upon it quite as a matter of course, which required no particular delicacy of handling. "And a much better thing too, lady, in every respect," he continued, seeing that he had called up a blush in Constance's cheek, and fancying that it arose from a fear of his disapproving her choice. "If you will tell the lord cardinal all the circumstances, depend upon it, he will not press you to do anything you dislike. Let him have the whole history, my dear lady. Tell him that you do not love Lord Darby, and that he loves another, and then show him how dearly Darnley loves you, and how you love him in return, and then—" "Oh, hush, hush, my dear Dr. Wilbraham," said the lady, with the blood glowing through her fair clear skin, over neck and face and forehead. "Impossible, indeed, quite impossible. You forget." "Oh, yes, yes, I did forget," replied the chaplain. "Osborne does not wish his name to be known. I did forget, very true. That is unfortunate. But cannot you just insinuate that you do love some one else, but do not like to mention his name?" Lady Constance now endeavoured to make the simple clergyman understand that under any circumstances she would be obliged to limit her reply to the cardinal to a plain refusal to wed Lord Darby, and though he could not enter into any feelings of reluctance on her part to avow her regard for Darnley, yet he fully comprehended that she was bound to hold undivulged the confidence of others. However, he did not cease to lament that this was the case, fully convinced in his own mind that if she had been able to inform Wolsey of everything, the prelate, whom he judged after his own heart, would have unhesitatingly accorded his sanction to all her wishes, whereas at present her refusal might be attributed to obstinacy, being unsupported by any reasons, and thus, indeed, he observed, Sir Cesar's prediction might be fulfilled, and she obliged to fly to screen herself from the consequences. Dr. Wilbraham having admitted that there might be a necessity for flight, the mind of Constance was infinitely quieted, that being a point on which she had long, long wished to ascertain his opinion, yet had timidly held back, believing him to be unacquainted with the most powerful motive that actuated her. Nothing now remained but to learn whether he would also so far sanction her proceedings as to accompany her, and she was considering the best means of proposing it to him, when she received a message to inform her that the cardinal waited her in the little tapestried hall. The moment which was to decide her fate she plainly perceived to be now arrived, but, with all the gentle sweetness of her character, a fund of dauntless resolution had descended to her from a long line of warlike ancestors, which failed not to come to her aid in moments of danger and extremity; and though she had long dreaded the interview to which she was now called, she prepared to undergo it with courage and firmness. In obedience to the cardinal's command, then, she descended to the hall, accompanied by 2 of her women, who, though neither likely to suffer anything themselves, nor informed of their mistress's situation, yet felt much more alarm at the thoughts of approaching the imperious Wolsey than even she herself did, burthened as her mind was with the certainty of offending a man the limit of whose power it was not easy to define. At the door of the hall stood 2 of the cardinal's ushers, by whom she was introduced into the chamber to which Wolsey had retired after leaving the king, and where, seated in a chair of state, he waited her approach with many an ensign of his pomp and power about. As she entered, he fixed his eye upon her, scarcely rising from his seat, but still slightly bending his head in token of salutation. The high blood of de Grey, however, though flowing in a woman's veins, and one of the gentlest of her sex, was not made to humble itself before the upstart prelate; and moving forward unbidden, Lady Constance calmly seated herself in a chair opposite to that of the cardinal, while her women placed themselves behind her, and thus, in silence, she waited for him to speak. "Lady," said Wolsey, when she was seated, "at the time I saw you last, I proposed to you a marriage, which in point of rank, of fortune, and of every other accessory circumstance, is one which may well be counted amongst the best of the land, and for which I expected to have your thanks. Instead thereof, however, I received, at the moment of my departure for York, a letter wherein, with a mild obstinacy and an humble pride, you did reject what was worthy of your best gratitude. A month has now waned since then, and I trust that calm reflection has restored you to your sense of what is right, which being the case, all that is past shall be pardoned and forgot." "Your proposal, my lord cardinal," replied Lady Constance, "was doubtless intended for my happiness, and therein you have my most sincere gratitude. But yet I see not how I can have merited either reproof or pardon, in a matter which, alone concerning myself, no one can judge of but myself." "You speak amiss, lady," said Wolsey haughtily. "Ay, and very boldly do you speak. Am I not your guardian by the English law? And are you not my ward? Say, lady, say." "I am your ward, my lord," replied Lady Constance, her spirit rising under his oppression, "but not your slave. You are my guardian, but not my master." "You are nice in your refinements, lady," said the cardinal; "but if I am your guardian, I am to judge what is good for you, till such time as the law permits you to judge for yourself." "That time is within 1 month, my lord," answered Constance; "and even were it longer, I never yet did hear that a guardian could force a ward to wed against her will, though I at once acknowledge his right to forbid her marriage where he may judge against it." "Nay," exclaimed Wolsey, "this is somewhat too much. This bold spirit, lady, becomes you not, and must be abated. Learn, that though I in gentleness rule you but as a ward, and for your own good control your stubborn will, the king, your sovereign, may act with a stronger hand, and, heedless of your idle fancies, compel you to obey." "Then to the king, my sovereign, I appeal," said Constance, "sure that his justice and his clemency will yield me that protection which, God help me, I much need." "Your appeal is in vain, proud girl," cried the cardinal, rising angrily, while the fiery spirit flashed forth from his dark eye. "I stand here armed in this case with the king's power, and commissioned to speak his will; and 'tis in his name that I command you, on Thursday next, at God's altar, to give your hand to your noble cousin, Lord Darby, ay, and gratefully to give it. without which you may fall to beggary and want. For know that all those broad lands which now so swell your pride are claimed by Sir Payan Wileton in right of male descent, and may pass away like a shadow from your feeble hand, leaving you naught but your vanity for dowry." "Then let them pass," said Constance firmly, "for I would sooner 1,000 times be landless, friendless, hopeless, than wed a man I do not love." "And end your days in a nunnery, you should have added to the catalogue of woes you call upon your head," said the cardinal sternly; "for as I live, such shall be your fate. Choose either to give your vows to your cousin or to heaven, lady, for no other choice shall be left you. Till Thursday next I give you to decide, and while you ponder, York Place shall be your abode. Lady, no more," he added, seeing her about to speak. "I have not time to argue against your fine wit. To-night, if I reach Westminster in time, I will send down your litter; if not, to-morrow by 8 of the clock, and be you prepared. I have done." Constance would not trust her voice with any reply, for the very efforts she had made to conceal her agitation had but served to render it more overpowering, and it was now ready to burst forth in tears. Repressing them, however, she rose, and bending her head to the cardinal, returned to her own apartments. Here Dr. Wilbraham awaited her in no small anxiety to know the event of her conference with Wolsey, which, as it had been so short, he judged must be favourable. Lady Constance soon undeceived him, however, and shocked and indignant at the cardinal's haughty and tyrannical conduct, he at once agreed with the lady that she had no resource but flight. "It is very strange indeed," cried the good man. "I have often heard that the lord cardinal is haughty and cruel, and indeed men lay to his charge that he never does anything but for his own interest, but I would never believe it before. I thought that God would never have placed so much power in the hands of so bad a man. But his ways are inscrutable, and his name be praised. Now, my dear lady, what is to be done? Where are we to go? Had not I better go and tell Osborne, in order that he may know all about it?" "On no account," replied Constance, "however painful it may be, my good friend; and painful indeed it is, I acknowledge." And while she spoke, the long repressed tears burst forth, and rolled rapidly over her face. "I must go without even bidding him adieu. I would not for the world involve him at this time in a business which might bring about his ruin. He shall be innocent even of the knowledge of my flight, so that Wolsey shall have no plea against him. When his fate is fixed and the storm is blown away, I will let him know where I am, for I owe him that at least. Even for you, my good Dr. Wilbraham, I fear," she continued, "if you fly with me, may it not bring down upon your head some ecclesiastical censure? If so, for heaven's sake, let me go with Margaret alone." "Why, it may indeed," answered the chaplain thoughtfully. "I have forgot that. It may indeed. What can be done?" "Then you shall stay," replied Lady Constance, with some degree of mournfulness of accent at the thought of the friendless loneliness with which she was going to cast herself upon the wide inhospitable world. "Then you shall stay indeed." "What, and leave you to wander about alone, I know not whither?" cried the young clergyman. "No, my child, no. Did all the dangers in the world hang over my head, where you go, there will I go too. If I cannot protect you much, which, God help me, is not in my power, at least I can console you under your sorrows, and support you during your pilgrimage, by pointing continually to that Being who is the protector of the widow and the orphan, the friend of the friendless and the desolate. Lady, I will go with you. All the dangers in the world shall not scare me from your side." A new energy seemed to have sprung up in the bosom of the clergyman, and by his advice and assistance, Lady Constance's plans and arrangements for her flight were very soon completed. It was agreed that herself, Dr. Wilbraham, and Mistress Margaret, the waiting woman, should immediately take boat, and proceed by water to the little village of Tothill, from whence a walk of 5 minutes would bring them to the house of the physician Dr. Butts, who, as the old chaplain observed, was, though his nephew, a man of an active and piercing mind, and would probably find some means to facilitate their escape to France. By landing some little way from his house, they hoped to prevent their route from being traced afterwards, and thus to evade pursuit, as to be overtaken and brought back would involve far more danger than even to remain where they were and dare the worst. All this being determined between Lady Constance and the clergyman, Mistress Margaret was called in, and informed of as much of the plan as was necessary to enable her to make up her mind whether she would accompany her young lady or not. Without a moment's hesitation, she decided upon going, and having received her orders, proceeded to arrange for their journey such articles of apparel as were absolutely necessary, together with all her lady's money and jewels. She also was deputed to inform the other servants that Lady Constance thought it best to follow the Lord Cardinal to York Place immediately, instead of waiting for the litter which he had promised to send, and that she only permitted herself and Dr. Wilbraham to accompany her. Everything being ready, a man was sought to carry the 2 large bags to which their luggage was restricted, and Constance prepared to put in execution the very important step on which she had determined. Her heart sank, it is true, and her spirit almost failed, as Dr. Wilbraham took her by the hand to lead her to the boat, but remembering to what she would expose herself if she stayed, she recalled her courage and proceeded on her way. In the antechamber, however, she had a painful scene to go through, for her women, not deceived by Mistress Margaret's tale, clung round their lady for what they deemed might be a last farewell. All of them, born upon her father's lands, had grown up, as it were, with her, and for some good quality called from amongst the other peasantry to the honour of serving the heiress of de Grey, had become attached to her by early habit, as well as by the affection which her gentle manners and sweet disposition were certain to produce in all those by whom she was surrounded. Many a bitter tear was shed by the poor girls as they saw their lady about to leave them, and Constance herself, unable to refrain from weeping, thereby not only encouraged their grief, but confirmed their fears. Angry with herself for giving way to her feelings when she felt the absolute necessity of governing them strictly, Constance gently disengaged herself from her maids, and promising to let them hear of her soon, proceeded to the waterside, where they easily procured a boat to convey them down the river. The irrevocable step was now taken, and Constance and the chaplain both sat in silence, contemplating the vague future, and striving, amidst all the dim uncertain shapes that it presented, to ascertain, even as far as probability went, what might be their fate. But the dark impenetrable curtain, drawn ever between to-day and to-morrow, still barred their view, leaving only room for hope and fear to range within the wide circle of unceasing doubt. Long before arriving at Tot Hill, the sun had gone down, and the cold wind, blowing from the river, chilled Lady Constance as she sat in the open boat without any other covering than a long veil added to her ordinary apparel. Notwithstanding this, she judged it best to bid their 2 rowers continue their course as far as Westminster, fearing that the little knowledge of the localities possessed, either by Dr. Wilbraham or herself, might cause them to lose their way if they pursued their original intention of landing at Tot Hill, and hoping that the darkness, which was now coming thick upon them, would at least conceal their path from the boat to the house of Dr. Butts. To ensure this, as soon as they landed, Mistress Margaret took one of the bags, and the good clergyman the other, and having satisfied the boatmen for their labour, the whole party began to thread the narrow, tortuous lanes and streets constituting the good town of Westminster. After various turnings and windings, however, they discovered that they were not on the right track, and were obliged to ask their way of an old locksmith, who was just shutting up his shop. The direction they received from the worthy artificer was somewhat confused, and contained so many rights and lefts, that by the time they had taken 2 more turnings, each person of the 3 had got a different reading of the matter, and could in no way agree as to their farther proceeding. "He said we were to go on in this street till we came to a lantern, I am sure," said Dr. Wilbraham. "No, no, sir," cried Mistress Margaret. "It was the next street, after we had turned to the left. Did he not say, take the first street to the right, and then the first again to the right, and then the second to the left, and then go on till we came to a lantern?" Dr. Wilbraham denied the position, and the matter was only terminated by Constance proposing that they should proceed to the second turning at least. "Then, if we see a light in the street to the left," she continued, "we may reasonably suppose that that is the turning he meant, unless before that we find a lantern here too, and then we can but ask again. But make haste, my dear Dr. Wilbraham, for there is a man behind who seems as if he were watching us." This last observation quickened all their motions, and proceeding as far as possible, they found that Mistress Margaret was in the right, for immediately in the centre of the second turning, to the left, appeared a lantern, shedding its dim small light down the long perspective of the street, which, be it remarked, was highly favourable in having such an appendage, few and scanty being the lights that, in that age, illuminated the streets of London after dark, and those, as in the present instance, being the boon of private individuals. Pursuing their way, then, towards this brilliant luminary, with many a look behind to ascertain whether they were followed, which did not appear to be the case, they found another street diverging to the right, which shared in the beneficent rays of the lantern, and which also conducted into a known latitude, namely, a sort of little square, that was instantly recognised by the chaplain as being in the immediate proximity of his nephew's dwelling. The house of Dr. Butts now soon presented itself, and entering the little court before it, the clergyman was just about to knock against the door which fronted them, when someone, entering the court from the street, laid hold of his arm, saying, "Stop, stop, if you please. You must come with me to my Lord Cardinal." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Darnley by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Come with words as medicinal as true, honest as either. Shakespeare. Now there are many people who would here leave their reader in suspense, and darting off to some other part of the tale, would not give the most remote hint of Lady Constance's fate, till they had drawled through 2 or 3 long chapters about a frog and a roasted apple, or any other thing, if possible still more irrelevant. But far be such disingenuous dealings from me, whose sole aim, intent, and object is to give my reader pleasure, and by now and then detailing some little accident or adventure, to keep him just enough awake to prevent the volume falling out of his hand into the fire, to win sometimes a smile, and sometimes a sigh, without aspiring either to laughter or tears, tickling his soul, as it were, with the point of a feather, so as neither to rouse nor to lull, and to leave him in such a state that when he lays down the book he knows not whether he has been reading or dreaming. Such are the luxurious aspirations of Vonderbrugius, who is recorded to have himself written more than 1 volume in his sleep, and to have even carried them to the printer in a state of somnambulancy. After this, without more ado, he proceeds to relate that the worthy Dr. Wilbraham, finding somebody take him by the arm, turned round in a state of vexation and worry, if I may use the word, which overcame the natural gentleness of his disposition, and made him demand, rather sharply, what the stranger wanted with him. "Why, doctor," replied the man, "you must come instantly to my lord cardinal, who has been struck with the pestilent air in returning from Richmond, and desires to consult with you on the means of preventing its bad effects." "Pshaw!" cried the good chaplain pettishly. "I'm not Dr. Butts. How could you frighten me so? We come to see the doctor ourselves." "Stand out of the way, then, if you are not him," cried the man, changing his tone, and rudely pushing between the clergyman and Lady Constance. "The cardinal must be served first, before such as you, at least." And knocking loudly against the door, he soon brought forth a page, who informed him that the physician was at the house of old Sir Guy Willoughby, farther down in the same street. On this news the messenger immediately set off again, leaving Dr. Wilbraham to discuss what matters he liked with the page, now that his own insolent haste was satisfied. The servants instantly recognised their master's uncle, and permitted him, with his fair companions, to enter and take possession of his book-room, while awaiting his return; and the rosy maid, whom Sir Osborne had found scrubbing crucibles, now bustled about with good-humoured activity to make the lady comfortable. Long seemed the minutes, however, to the mind of poor Constance, till the physician's return. Her path was now entirely amidst uncertainties, and at each step she knew not whether it would lead her to safety or destruction. Such a proceeding as that in which she was engaged does not strike one, when calmly related, as full of half the anxiety and alarm that really accompanied it. Let it be remembered that not only her fortune, but her liberty for life, and the whole happiness of her existence, were involved, and it may be then conceived that with trembling fear she awaited each incident that might tend to forward her escape or to betray her flight. Though it seemed to her an age, Dr. Butts was not really long in returning, but no language can depict the astonishment of his countenance when he beheld Lady Constance with his uncle. "Odds life!" cried he, "what is this? Lady, are you ill, or well, or wise? Uncle, are you mad, or drunk, or foolish?" The good clergyman informed him that he was in none of the predicaments to which he alluded, and then proceeded to relate the circumstances and motives which had induced them to resolve upon leaving the court of England and flying to France, to claim the protection of the French king, who was, in fact, the lady's sovereign as far as regarded her maternal estates. "It's a bad business," cried Dr. Butts, who still stood in the middle of the floor, rubbing his chin, and not yet recovered from his surprise. "It's a bad business. I always thought it would be a bad business. Nay, nay, lady, do not weep," continued the kind-hearted mediciner, seeing the tears that began to roll silently over Constance's cheek. "It is not so bad as that. Wolsey will doubtless claim you at the hands of the French king, but Francis is not a man to give you up. However, take my advice. Retire quietly to one of your châteaux, and live like a nun till such time as this great friendship between the two courts is past. It will not last long," he added, with a sententious shake of the head. "It will not last long. But, nevertheless, you keep yourself in France as secretly as may be, while it does last." "But how to get to France is the question," said Dr. Wilbraham. "We shall do well enough when we are there, I doubt not. It is how to get to France that we must think of." "Oh, we will manage that," replied Dr. Butts. "We will manage that, though, indeed, these are not things that I like to meddle with. But, nevertheless, I suppose I must in this case. Nay, nay, my dear lady, do not grieve. 'Slife, you are a soldier's daughter, and afraid. Nay, cheer up, cheer up. It shall go right, I warrant." The doctor seated himself, and observing that Constance looked pale and cold, he insisted on her swallowing a Venice glass of mulled sack and going to bed. As to the sack, he said, he would insure it for the best in Europe; and in regard to the beds in his house, he could only say that he had once entertained the four most famous alchemists of the world, and they were not men to sleep on hard beds. "Taste the sack, lady, taste the sack," he continued. "Believe me, it is the best medicine in the pharmacy, and certainly the only one I ever take myself. Then while you go and court your pillow, I will devise some scheme with this good uncle of mine to help you over to the Frenchman's shore." The physician's rosy maid was now called, and conducted Lady Constance and Mistress Margaret to a handsome bedchamber, where we shall leave them for the present, and without prying into Dr. Butts's household furniture, return to the consultation that was going on below. "Well, uncle," said the physician, as soon as Lady Constance had left them, "you have shown your wisdom truly in running away with an heiress for another man. On my life, you have beaten the man who was hanged for his friend, saying that he would do as much for him another time. Why, do you know you can never show your face in England again?" "My good nephew," replied Dr. Wilbraham quietly, "for all your fine words, if you had been in my situation, you would have done just as I have done. I know you, Charles." "Not I, faith!" cried Dr. Butts. "I would not have budged a foot." "What! when you saw her cast upon the world, friendless and helpless," cried the old man, "with nobody to advise her, with nobody to aid her, with nobody to console her? So sweet a girl, too! Such an angel in heart, in mind, in disposition, all desolate and alone in this wild, rough world. Fie, Charles, fie! You would have gone with her." "Perhaps I might," replied the physician. "However, let us now think of the best means of serving her. What can be done?" As usual in such cases, 50 plans were propounded, which, on examination, were found to be unfeasible. "I have it!" cried Dr. Butts at last, after discarding an infinite variety. "There was a nun's litter came up yesterday to the inn hard by. It will hold 3, but you shall set off to morrow by daybreak as nuns." "But how?" cried Dr. Wilbraham, with horror and astonishment depicted in his face. "You don't mean me to go as a nun?" "Faith, but I do," replied the physician. "It would be fully as bad for you to be discovered as for Lady Constance. Now, there is no dress in the world that I know of but a nun's that will cover your face and hide your beard. Oh, you shall be a nun by all means. I will get the 3 dresses this very night from a frippery in Poole Street. I will knock them up, and you shall be well shaved to morrow morning, and will make as fine an old Sister Monica as the best of them." Dr. Wilbraham still held out stoutly, declaring that he would not so disguise himself and disgrace his cloth on any account or consideration. Nor was it till the physician showed him plainly that by this means alone Lady Constance's safety could be ensured, that he would at all hear of the travesty thus proposed. "Where, then, do you intend us to go?" asked Dr. Wilbraham, almost crying with vexation at the bare idea of being so metamorphosed. "I cannot, and I will not, remain long in such a dress." "Why, you must go down to Sandwich," answered the physician. "There is a religious house there, under a sub-prioress, about a mile out of the town, looking out over the sea. I know the dame, and a little money will do much with her. Nay, look not shocked, good uncle. I mean not to say that she is wicked, and would endanger her soul's repose for mammon, but she is one of those that look leniently on small faults, and would not choke at such an innocent sin as helping you out of the cardinal's power. The time is lucky too, for the cold wind last night has given his haughty lord cardinalship a flow of humours to the head, and he is as frightened about himself as a hen before a dray horse, so that perhaps he may not think of sending to Richmond as soon as he proposed." "But Charles," said Dr. Wilbraham, whose abhorrence of the nun's dress was not to be vanquished, and who would have been right glad to escape the infliction on any excuse, "will not your servants, who have seen us come in one dress, think it very strange when they see us go away in another, and may they not betray us?" "Pshaw!" cried Dr. Butts. "They see 1,000 odder things every day in a physician's house. Do you think I let my servants babble? No, no. They know well that they must have neither eyes, ears, nor understanding for anything that passes within these doors. If I were to find that they even did so much as to recollect a person they had once seen with me, they should troop. But stay, go you to bed and rest. I will away for these dresses, and bespeak the litter for tomorrow at 5. At Sandwich you are sure to find a bark for Boulogne." The next morning Dr. Wilbraham was awakened before it was light by the physician entering his room with a candle in his hand, and followed by a barber, who, taking the good priest by the nose, shaved him most expeditiously before he was out of bed, having been informed by Dr. Butts that the person under his hands was a poor insane patient, who would not submit to any very tedious tonsorial operation. When this was done, much to the surprise of the chaplain, who was in truth scarcely awake, the barber was sent away, and the physician produced the long black dress of a Benedictine nun, into which, after much entreaty, he persuaded Dr. Wilbraham to get; not, however, without the rest of his clothes, for no argument would induce him to put on the woman's dress without the man's under it. First, then, he was clothed with his ordinary black vest and silk hose, above which came a full and seemly cassock, and then, as a superstructure, was placed at the top of all the long black robes of the nun, which swelled his bulk out to no inconsiderable size. This, however, was not a disadvantage, for being tall and thin, he had great need for some supposititious contour to make his height seem less enormous when conjoined with his female habiliments. Upon the whole, with the rope tied round his middle, and the coif and veil, he made a very respectable nun, though there was in the whole figure a certain long-backed rigidity of carriage and straggling wideness of step that smacked infinitely of the masculine gender. When all was completed, the physician led his transformed uncle down to a little hall, to which Lady Constance and Mistress Margaret had already found their way, habited in similar garments to those which Dr. Butts had furnished for the chaplain. In point of beauty, Constance had never, perhaps, looked better than now, when her small, exquisite features and clear, delicate complexion, slightly shaded by the nun's cap, had acquired an additional degree of softness, which harmonized well with the pensive, melancholy expression that circumstances had communicated to her countenance. However, she was, perhaps, even more sad and agitated than the night before, when haste had in some degree superseded thought. She had now passed a nearly sleepless night, during the long hours of which 1,000 fears and anxieties had visited her pillow, and on rising, the necessity of quitting her customary dress and assuming a disguise impressed more strongly than ever upon her mind the dangers of her situation. The only person that seemed fully in her element was Mistress Margaret, who, though, with the exception of a little selfishness, a most excellent being, could not be expected to have fulfilled for several years the high functions of lady's maid without having acquired some of the spirit of the office. God knows, in Lady Constance's service, she had possessed small opportunity of exercising in any way her talents for even the little intrigue d'antichambre; and though, in the case of Sir Osborne, she had done her best to show her tact by retiring à propos, the present was the first occasion on which she could enjoy a real, bustling, energetic adventure, and, to do her justice, she enacted the nun to the life. With a vastly consequential air she hurried about, till the rustling of her black serge and the rattling of her wooden cross and rosary were quite edifying; and finding herself, by dress at least, on an equality with her mistress, she took the bridle off her tongue and let it run its own course, which it did not fail to do with great vigour and activity. On the entrance of Dr. Wilbraham, with his face clad in rueful solemnity, and his long strides at every step spreading out the petticoats with which his legs were environed, like the parachute of a balloon when it begins to descend, Mistress Margaret laughed outright, and even Lady Constance, while reproving her for her ill-placed gaiety, could hardly forbear a smile. "My dear Dr. Wilbraham," said Constance, seeing the chagrin that sat upon his countenance, "for how very much have I to thank you, and believe me, I feel deeply all the regard you must have for me, to induce you to assume a disguise that must be so disagreeable to you." "Well," said Dr. Butts, "you are a sweet creature, and to my mind it would not be difficult to make a man do anything to serve you. However, sit you down, lady. Here is something to break your fast; and as it must serve for dinner and supper too, I will have you eat whether you are hungry or not, for there must be as little stopping on the road as possible, and no chattering, Mistress Margaret. Mind you that." Mistress Margaret vowed that she was silence itself; and the meal which the good doctor's foresight had taken care to provide for them being ended, he led them forth by a different door from that which had given them entrance, not choosing to trust even the servants, of whose discretion he had boasted the night before. Day had now dawned, and in the courtyard of the inn they found a large litter, or sort of long box swung between two horses, one before and the other behind, and accompanied by a driver on horseback, who, smacking his whip, seemed tired of waiting for them. "Come, get in," cried he. "I have been waiting half an hour. There's room enough for you, sure," he proceeded, seeing some little difficulty occur in placing the travellers, Why, I brought four just like you up from Gloucester in it 3 days ago. Here, come over to this side, Mother Longshanks." This address to Dr. Wilbraham had again very near overset Miss Margaret's gravity; but at length, all being placed, in spite of the chaplain's long legs, which were rather difficult to pack, the travellers took leave of the physician and commenced their journey to the sea coast. All passed on tranquilly enough through the forenoon, and at a little watering house where they stopped on the road, they were enabled quietly to rehearse their parts, as Sister Wilbraham, Sister Margaret, and Sister Grey. The good clergyman declared that his part should be to keep down his veil and hold his tongue, and Mistress Margaret willingly undertook to be the talker for the whole party, while Constance, not yet at all assured of safety, listened for every sound with a beating heart, and trembled at every suspicious look that she beheld, or fancied that she beheld, in the people around her. As soon as the horses were sufficiently refreshed, they again began their journey, and had proceeded some way when the galloping of a horse made itself heard behind them, and through the opening of the curtains they could perceive a sergeant-at-arms, with full cognizance, and accompanied by 2 followers, pass by the side of their vehicle. In a moment after, he stopped on overtaking their driver, who was a little in advance, and seemed to question him in a hasty tone. "3 nuns!" cried he at length. "I must see that." Constance, almost fainting, drew back in the corner of the litter, while Dr. Wilbraham shrunk himself up to the smallest space possible, and in fact Mistress Margaret was the only one who preserved her presence of mind. "If it were the Lord Cardinal himself," whispered she to her lady, "he would never know you, my lady, in that dress." In the meantime, the sergeant-at-arms rode up, and drew back the curtain of the litter. "Your pardon, ladies," said he, giving a look round which seemed quite satisfactory. "I ask your pardon, but as I am sent in pursuit of some runaways, I was obliged to look in." Here the matter would have terminated, had not Mistress Margaret, desirous of showing off a total want of fear, replied, "Quite welcome, fair sir, quite welcome. We are travelling the same road." The officer replied, and this brought on a long allegory on the part of Mistress Margaret, who told him that they were nuns of Richborough, who had been to London for medical advice for poor Sister Mary there, in the corner, pointing to Dr. Wilbraham, who was troubled with the falling sickness. The sergeant-at-arms recommended woodlice drowned in vinegar as a sovereign cure, which the pretended nun informed him they had tried, and though it must be owned that the abigail played her part admirably well, yet nevertheless she contrived to keep her lady and the chaplain in mortal fear for half an hour longer than was necessary. At length, however, the officer, taking his leave, rode away, and then descended upon the head of Mistress Margaret the whole weight of good Dr. Wilbraham's indignation. Not for many years had he preached such an eloquent sermon upon the duty of adhering strictly to the truth as on the present occasion, and he pointed out clearly to the waiting woman that she had told at least 32 lies more than the circumstances required. Mistress Margaret, however, was obstinate in her error, and would not see the distinction, declaring angrily that she would either tell no lies at all, and let it be known who they were, or she would tell as many as she thought proper. "Margaret," said Lady Constance, in a calm, reproachful tone, that had more effect than a more violent reproof, "you forget yourself." The abigail was silent, but nevertheless she determined in her own mind to give the good doctor more truth than he might like, on the very first occasion; and such an opportunity was not long in occurring. With the usual hankering which drivers and postilions always have for bad inns, the master of the litter did not fail to stop for the night at one of the smallest, meanest, and most uncomfortable little alehouses on the road; and on getting out of the vehicle, the 3 nuns were all shown into one room, containing 2 beds, one large and one small one. It may easily be supposed that such an arrangement did not very well suit the circumstances of the case, and Constance looked at Dr. Wilbraham, and Dr. Wilbraham at Constance, in some embarrassment. On inquiring whether they could not have another room, they were informed that there was indeed such a thing in the house, but that it was always reserved for guests of quality. The hostess was surprised at nuns giving themselves such airs. The room they had would do very well for 3 people, and, in short, that they should have no other. During all this time, Mistress Margaret remained obstinately silent, but at length, seeing the distress of her mistress, she brought up her forces to the charge, and turned the tide of battle. Attacking the hostess full tilt, she declared that there should be another room found directly, informing her that the young lady was not a simple nun, but noble and rich, and just named prioress of the Lord knows where; that Sister Mary, i.e. Dr. Wilbraham, was badly troubled with a night cough, which would keep the prioress awake at night; and, in short, that Sister Mary must and should have a room to herself, for which, however, they would willingly pay. This latter hint overcame the hostess's objections, and the matter being thus settled, they were allowed to repose in peace for the night. Fatigue, anxiety, and want of sleep had now completely exhausted Constance, and weariness, acting the part of peace, closed her eyes in happy forgetfulness till the next morning, when they again set out for Sandwich. Without any new adventure, they arrived at that town, and after passing through it, quickly perceived the convent rising on a slight elevation to the left. As soon as this was in sight, so that he could not miss his way, Dr. Wilbraham got out of the litter for the purpose of pulling off his nun's dress under some hedge, in order that, by following a little later than themselves, he might appear at the gate of the nunnery in his true character, without the change being remarked by the driver of the litter, to whom he said on descending that he would follow on foot. After this, Constance and Mistress Margaret proceeded alone, and in a few minutes reached the convent, where, presenting Dr. Butts's letter to the prioress, they were received with all kindness and attention, and found themselves comparatively free from danger. Dr. Wilbraham was not long in arriving, restored to his proper costume, and being admitted to the parlour, entered into immediate consultation with the superior and Constance, as to the best means of concluding their flight as happily as it had commenced. Chapter 29.